Lee Shoquist, it's been a while. I would say it's been too long since we had our marathon year looking at all the Friday the 13th movies in the franchise. And at some point, we talked about A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge. Now we're going to talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors from 1987. It just had its 35th anniversary. I don't know if that makes you feel incredibly old, but I couldn't believe it.
Reason to feel old these days. But you know what? The thing is this, I always say I'm glad I grew up in the 70s and 80s because of all the pop culture, and we would have never seen these movies in the theater or the drive-in if we hadn't grown up at that time. So that's all good. So I just try to remind myself of that I have those memories.
So do you get to see, you saw Dream Warriors in the theater or
Oh
on a
yeah.
big screen first? Wow.
Oh yeah. So I mean I saw the original Nightmare on Elm Street on the big screen. I mean I was there for the slasher era. I'm not going to tell how old I am, but I was old enough. So I saw, I've seen them all in the theater.
I keep forgetting because you saw like all the Fridays and stuff early on. And yeah, when I was growing up, my parents kept me from all the horror stuff. They let me watch, well, my dad let me watch like Porky's 2 and 3, but when it came to Elm Street or Jason or anything, it was like, no, that's off limits. So I didn't see this until, well, I guess I still saw it when I was a kid because one night, I think I was 11, my mom and I rented a bunch of the Elm Street movies for, just for the heck of it. And we both ended up becoming like big horror fanatics. So that was kind of cool. But I didn't see Elm Street 3 until much later. I just remember
I
on,
just think this is our story. I mean, me and you and lots of other people that were off limits to us, right? But we had a couple of things going for us. We could sneak into the theaters if we wanted to be bold about it and get a ticket for a PG movie and go see Dream Warriors, or we were there at the dawn of the video boom, so we could just catch up on them a couple of years later when we were deemed mature enough by our parents. So I definitely understand what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, I think the only, like when it came out, I think for that first year, my only exposure to it was the Dokken music video for Dream Warriors, which I loved. And also, I think Bill Harris in Hollywood had that show, like he had like a movie minute kind of thing, and he would show clips and kind of talk about it. And I had recorded that on a VHS, and I would watch it religiously because he had the scene where Joey gets tied to the bed with the tongues. And I was like, what is this movie? I have to see it.
Yeah, I
So
mean, it's those are the things that you remember from these movies. I mean, first of all, you just remember those sequences, those horror sequences. I mean, even with part two, what you would remember, I remembered. I mean, I saw part two on the opening night with my ninth grade English teacher, who became a friend of mine, and we would go to the movies and things like that. And I remember the horror sequences. I never remember the subtext to the movie, the other parts of the movie that everybody talks about now. And the same thing with this one. I remember the horror sequences, right? Like the tongues to the bed, but you kind of forget about all the connective tissue in the movie. And so when you go back and look at it, there's just more there to consider,
well, and that's the thing that struck me watching it, for the first time, I think, with really adult eyes a few days ago, was how, and the same thing happened with Tim Burton's Batman, strangely enough, a couple of weeks ago. I realized how much these, late 80s, kind of fantasy, pulpy movies, they were really tight and they were really about stuff, and they had a creative team that were really swinging for the fences. I mean, this was Chuck Russell's first feature film, which is amazing. And he co-wrote it, or well, he directed it, and then it was co-written by Frank Darabont. And you can see the seeds of their stuff, their later stuff, in this movie. It's fantastic.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, Frank Darabont and Chuck Russell. You think Chuck Russell, who went on to do Eraser and then The Mask and other things like that, and essentially was an unknown property at the moment. And the studio trusted him. They put around him, as Rachel Talalay said, the producer of the film. They put talented people around, young directors. So they were never afraid. The studio was not afraid of hiring a young director. They would just surround them with talented technicians who could make sure the film would get done. And so it's so interesting to think about what Frank Darabont would go on to do and what Chuck Russell would go on to do and so forth, because I mean, they're like in a training ground, and they cut their teeth in a way on making genre films, like so many directors did make genre films at the beginning before they went on to do more respectable types of movies. But nonetheless.
And that's the thing that the other thing that I really picked up on watching it this time is, Freddy kind of gets lumped in with the slashers. He's got, he was a child molester and he came back from the dead and he's got razors on his fingers and he murders teenagers, but he's not really a slasher. This is a horror fantasy franchise. And I feel like in part 3, it kicks into high gear. Usually franchises are like spinning into the ground by the third entry, but this was finding its feet and kind of set the tone for what the rest of the series, good and bad, will be. They built more mythology. They kind of redefined what these characters were. They were, a team of, not helpless kids. They were the last of the Elm Street children. They brought back, the heroine from the first movie, which everybody loves to do now, but it's so cheesy nowadays. But with Nancy Thompson in this, not only is it a triumphant return, but it's an emotional ending to that character.
Oh yeah, because look, it's possible to write genre movies with a little bit of substance. They don't always have to just be the basics of the thing they're trying to exploit, which is the violence or the nudity or otherwise. And they can be written with a little bit more integrity to them. And so this film, it's funny, you look at it with adult eyes when you're a teenager looking at it. This isn't a knock on teenagers, but you typically are looking for the thrills in the film. But when you look back now, you see John Saxon and Heather Langenkamp playing out this kind of drama about a strange father and daughter, and there's more gravitas to it in a way, and of course that extends to the psychological predicament of all the main characters in the film. When you look at it as an adult, it just seems to have a little bit more substance or integrity to it. I think it's an example of a movie that tried to do something new and different, and I think it succeeded for the most part.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Donald Thompson, because he was like the sheriff in the first movie, Nancy's dad. And this one, he's a drunk. He's working as a security guard because his life completely fell to tatters. But when you see him in that bar, he's still wearing the sheriff's badge over his crappy, stained work uniform. It just says so much about where he is mentally that you don't need this whole speech about what happened in the intervening years. It's all just there in that badge.
There's of course the mention of what happened to the Ronnie Blakely character, that she died in her bed and so forth. But the movie presents in its own very basic way a picture of a family estrangement, or a family that's been ruined in a way by the trauma of what's happened. And so that's what I guess I mean when I say I think the film's trying to do something a little more interesting or have a little more substance to it. And I want to capitalize on something you said a minute ago with respect to this film being kind of a launching pad for subsequent films in the series. And I think we've talked about several of them. We did A New Nightmare together a year or two ago, and the notion in the film that the series would take a different direction with respect to Fred Krueger, that it would be a sort of, that he might be the center of the film, or that turn into a bit of I don't want to say a jokester, but kind of the brand of the film unto himself in a way that was both funny and also scary. So it definitely turned in that direction. I understand that Wes Craven didn't like that, or he wasn't in agreement with that direction for the character, wasn't on board at the time, but it definitely went in that direction. I don't know what you think of that. I have some friends who just absolutely love when you talk about comic horror films like Return of the Living Dead, or the blend of comedy and horror in a film. And maybe it's a little bit of a bridge too far to say there's comedy in these films, but he definitely has a very sly persona that becomes greater as the series goes on from this point forward.
I would have to go back and watch, I guess, all of the, kind of like what we did with the Jason movies, and see the progression, because my memories of especially the later sequels are not fond. I love Robert Englund. I love this series in general, what it tries to do, but he just does get so wacky in parts that eventually it sort of became like the Jason films, where it's just about the nightmare set pieces. It's not really about the story. It's, oh, here's the comic book scene. Oh, here's the Jaws scene in the next one, Dream Master, which I actually like Dream Master a lot too, as a sequel to this film. But by the time you get to Freddy's dead and he's got the power glove, I'm like, this is almost like the Scary Movie of Nightmare on Elm Street films.
It's funny. There's a little bit of a catch-22. First of all, you have to always top yourself with the next film, right? You're always trying to go up a level, or do something that's going to, when the audience comes back, they're going to see something they haven't already seen. But what happens is that you end up kind of putting yourself into a corner further and further as films go on, because even though you have the technology to do really interesting things, the imagination to do cool effects and dream sequences, you inevitably at a certain point tilt the franchise into some other realm, which is away from the people in the story. So the balance has to kind of be struck. But I think in an effort to make these films get bigger and bigger and more ingenious, that, as you mentioned, as the series goes on, it doesn't really it kind of loses something. It's lost something. And so I think this film is really the tipping point. And for me, I'm not one of those lovers of comic horror like some people are, and I guess I always find this villain to be really frightening. Even when I saw the film again last night, which I hadn't seen it in years, I thought Freddy Krueger was very frightening. I think because Robert Englund is so menacing in the role, and he's so diabolical. There's never any doubt in these films that he will rip someone to shreds if he's given the opportunity to be able to do it. And so I always find something about him, the fact that he moves quick and he's just his physicality is imposing or threatening in a way. So I prefer that particular bent on the character. It's in the first two films. I mean, there are some comic one-liners in both of those films too. There are not, they're sly entendres or otherwise. But I think the idea of making Freddy the base of the franchise, for me, it sort of loses something after a while, because the darkness of the character or the menace of the character gets a little bit lost after that happens. But there's kind of no going back after this film, because this film does that. So I guess I really prefer the first two films, even though saying that you like the second film that much is a sacrilege in a way, unless you have a tongue in cheek or something. But yeah, I think that there's something diffused in the later films because he is the main draw.
And I think, what I loved about Dream Warriors, especially this time watching it, it does have that sort of Jaws effect for the first probably half the movie, where you don't really see Freddy. He doesn't manifest. He manifests as the giant worm that kind of attacks Patricia Arquette, who we got to talk about in a minute. You see him as, even a little marionette puppet. Yeah, he grows up to be the big Freddy, but he's not, making jokes. He's pretty much silent for the first half of the film. It's not, I don't think, until the tongue sequence where he shows up and says, "What's wrong, Joey? Feeling tongue-tied?" But even then, it's this almost like a bullying, kind of a hissing delivery. He's not the jokey kind of cackling Robert Englund that we would see in later films. There's a darkness to that scene. I think that carries on through the rest of the movie. Even when he says there's always room for more on the chest of souls, it's a creepy kind of like a whispering delivery. Whereas if he was to do this in, say, part 6, he would have said, "There's always room for more."
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. I think what you're saying is interesting. If we looked at the first two films, we would be saying that we have kind of a traditional set of teenagers, right? They're living in suburbia, and we have teenage romance going on, school activities, peer groups, and parental pressures, and kind of the very basic things that are in many films, not just horror films. So they're kind of identifiable. They attach us to the characters. I mean, Mark Patton in this second one, and of course, we have Johnny Depp and Heather Langenkamp and Amanda Wyss and the whole crew in the first film. But there's something about those characters that feels real. I think those are our, our access points to the film. But this is a different ballgame, because we're not given that in the third film. And so because we don't have that, and we don't really empathize, in my opinion, as much with the individual characters, we're kind of a little more attached to Freddy, I think. So that's what I would argue, is that there's a real shift there, and that what the kids are up to in this movie is far more serious and a little less relatable. Certainly it's socially relevant in its way as well, but it doesn't have that kid next door feel about it. Kid next door is thrust into extraordinary circumstances. What would you do if you were a high school student in a normal suburban community and this was happening to you? So it's a little harder for us to attach to Patricia Arquette and Jennifer Rubin and the whole group, because they're very extreme characters that not necessarily as relatable in my view. So that's why we attach to Freddy, and he becomes the central force of the film, in my view.
I would agree with you after this movie, because one of the problems after Dream Warriors is you get this idea that these are the last of the Elm Street children. So when they come up with part 4, because it's like you think that by they're doing Dream Warriors, they don't know if there's going to be a part four because this movie could come out and everyone's got Freddy fatigue, so it's kind of the last one. They kind of leave it, it's open ended at the very the very slightest crack is left, but Freddy could be dead. But then they're like, oh, it made all this money, we got to make a part four. What do you do with part four? Okay, now you've got a character who brings people into her dreams, and she passes that power on to these other characters that we've never heard of before. But
Yeah.
I think what's interesting here is there's a time jump between Elm Street 1 and Elm Street 3, but it's greater than that 3 years. It's actually I think it's at least 5 years. We see
Hmm.
first the 1989 prescription date on Nancy's Hypnosil, and then later on, I think she mentioned that she graduated a certain number of years ago or something like that. But
Hmm.
what I'm saying is, what you keyed in on in terms of the difference in the types of teenagers we're dealing with, I think that's an in the background evolution of this world, because I think the kids in this sleep clinic who are all suffering from the same illusion of Freddy Krueger stalking them in their dreams, I think they used to be those kids, but from years of their friends being horribly murdered and looking like suicides, their parents either not believing them or not believing that they can't face up to their own guilt from having killed Freddy Krueger. I think that's taken their toll. And so what you see even at the beginning of Dream Warriors is these kids have had to come together and form this club to, they stay up and they keep watch on each other. They're like sharing tips on how to stay awake.
Yeah.
They are these cornered animals. I think they're we don't get to see that in terms of an evolution on film, but I think it's in the story in the background.
It's interesting. I mean, that's a great point. In the first couple films, the fraternity of kids is, based around all the superficialities of, dating or staying out late or falling asleep in a class or something like that. And now the fraternity of the teenagers in this movie is that they're emotionally disturbed. That they're potentially suicidal or borderline in whatever way that what they are. And so it's very interesting that maybe they're just as close as the teens in the peer groups in the first couple of films, but they're bonded around something else, which is a little kind of daring for this movie to take all those characters and make them so troubled at the center of the film, and try. I believe they really are trying to make a statement about what these kids are going through, and they're in that support group, and the Dream Warriors, what that actually means, to band together. And as you know, near the end of the film, there are a few characters who have to kind of overcome in the dream world. They overcome some of the issues that they have in life. I mean, whether it's being in a wheelchair or not being able to speak for one reason or another. And so those things are overcome through the partnership and fraternity in the group, which is it's pretty interesting. I mean, I don't know whether that is even necessary to write that for an Elm Street movie, but they tried. I mean, they and that's interesting.
Yeah, the as far as the dynamic between the kids and the adults, I mean, the first two movies, the adults weren't really around, or if they were around, they're all, Nancy's mom was a drunk, dad was a workaholic cop. There weren't really, the parents in, part two were just like these kind of Reagan era puppets who were just kind of aloof and kind of clueless about things. In this one, you don't, the authority figures are pretty much Kirsten's mom, who just, she's a single mom and she wants to date and kind of party, but she's got this troubled teen. But then you got the people who are running the clinic. And what I loved is the antagonist in this movie, besides Freddy Krueger, is not a nurse Ratched. You've got the kind of supervising nurse who kind of looks like she could be that part, the evil, like, I don't know, all you kids are, crazy and we're going to treat you by putting you through electroshock therapy or something. She's not a villain. She just doesn't understand. She doesn't, I don't think she can believe what she's, seeing, even though Philip, the one kid who likes to play with the puppets, makes a great point about like the fact that everybody in that group dreamt about the same guy before they ever met each other doesn't seem to impress anyone. But there's Neil, who's the doctor that ends up working with Nancy. He's trying to understand. You've got Lawrence Fishburne as Max the orderly. He's just looking out for these kids and doing the best he can. You get when he finds Jennifer's body in the TV room, you see that look of heartbreak on his face. He's like surprised but not surprised but also sad. So I love that it's not just this cartoon, like the kids are, they know everything and the parents are just, stupid or they don't get it. There truly is compassion all the way around. But there's that line about, dream talents, you never lose your gift. You just forget how to use it. I think it's a beautiful metaphor for growing up.
It's great. I mean, I think that's all fair. First of all, points for using the phrase Jennifer's body, which you just said a moment ago. So secondly, I think that Priscilla Pointer, who plays Dr. Sims in the film, who's kind of the disbeliever, just can't kind of get her head around the idea that people could possibly be having these dreams, these mass delusions. She's pretty good in that role. She's not too extreme. But I think when you mention the parents in the first two films, they're movies in the 80s would always cast these parents in a way as being from another era. They have like kind of they really seem much older. The values are usually different in some way, and in fact, a lot of parents in the 80s were not like that. I mean, they were coming out of the flower power generation, or otherwise, I suppose they were baby boomers who were much younger at that point also. And so many of them were counterculture type parents and so forth. They don't often see that in movies. One great movie that did that was Valley Girl, if you remember, where we had Frederick Forrest and Colleen Camp, who played the Southern California health food store owning parents of the Valley Girl. But in these movies, when you mentioned the second one, you would get Clu Gulager and Hope Lang, who just played these kind of suburban older parents from another time, and in the first one you had Ronnie Blakely, who was on the bottle for the whole film, and then John Saxon, who was doing his thing. And now in this movie, it's interesting because even though we have some parents in the film, like Patricia Arquette's mother in the movie, who's in her own world and believes all this is being made up, the real parents are the surrogate parents there. And the surrogate parents are, of course, Nancy, who comes in as a new researcher on staff, and Craig Wasson, of course, who's the lead doctor there. And that's kind of an interesting part of the film, because they're liked and they're trusted, and they're believed for the most part by the kids who are in the facility, who are either parentless or alienated in some way. And so I thought that was interesting that the two of them become the surrogate parents. And there's a moment in the film where they decide that they're going to have their group meeting without Dr. Sims. And then, of course, everything goes completely wrong. But I got a little bit of a kick out of this scene. It was like mom and dad sitting down, all of the kids, and saying, look, this is going to be a family meeting time, because I thought even though they were younger, they were accessible and interesting. And I saw them as surrogate sort of authority figures or parents for these kids. And it was pretty interesting.
It's something that just occurred to me while you're talking about them as these sort of young parental figures. The teens in this movie manifest their dream powers. The adults do not. Nancy, when she gets into the dreamland, she's just kind of like following around these other kids, or sort of leading them. But Kincaid has his super strength, and Kirsten can do these flips and everything. But Nancy's just kind of Nancy. I wonder if that's some kind of a statement about either because they are so well. Nancy's been suppressing her dreams through Hypnosil. Neil Gordon, the doctor, he is brand new to this whole thing. He probably wouldn't, he'd need time to manifest some dream powers, but they don't even talk about it. I mean, the movie it's an hour and a half horror film, but I feel like you could have gone on to this little jag about like, what does Dr. Neil Gordon imagine himself being able to do in his dreams? Or is he so old and into the adult world that he no longer thinks about like, what could I do in a dream, other than like, filing papers or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, is that there's so much to think about when you're young, or you're a child. Your imagination runs free. You have endless view of the world, of what is possible for your future, what you can accomplish, what types of goals you'll set when you're leaving high school. As you get older, of course, the world kind of gets a lot smaller and a lot different. And they say sometimes if you're a young child, you could learn a language very easily, but if you try to learn the same language when you're 40 plus, it's going to be very hard to learn it because your mind is not in the same place. And so I think those characters, to your point, are in a different place. Nancy's pretty young, of course, still, but they're just in a different place. So the movie's suggesting that these are, even though they may be damaged characters who are institutionalized in some way, that they have a highly functioning I don't know if there was creativity. That's probably not what it is, but they have a highly functioning skill set in a way that's just not able to be seen or harnessed or in any way until they go into that other realm. And as we mentioned earlier, that's when the loss of the wheelchair and the ability to speak and things like that. I mean, that's when they kind of reach their potential.
Now I want to talk about the two deaths that we get in that climax. Will, who's the kid in the wheelchair, he, there's that great hallway scene with that amazing contraption, the wheelchair of death that comes roaring at him, and he manifests his wizard powers because he's big into D&D, and he blasts Freddy with this green energy. Was his undoing that he got too cocky and he let his guard down, or was he just never going to be strong enough to defeat Freddy no matter what his powers? What do you think?
I think he was strong enough to defeat him. I mean, and as you know, when he kind of jumps upon Freddy and so on and so forth, and then Freddy sort of, I forget exactly what happens in that moment. Does he just stab him as he's holding him in front of him or something like that?
I think he pulls out his heart, because
That's
there's
what
the
it is,
close up.
yeah.
He goes like, and you see him go, ah, and then there's a long shot of him kind of pulling back, and you see something. You can't see it beating because it's really far away, but that's why I always thought it was.
I think he's just no match for him in a way, and so that's how I perceived it. But I did think that was cool, that whole idea of the inner wizard manifesting in a way, and similarly with Jennifer Rubin's a character as well, which I thought was a Taryn character, was maybe one of the great moments in the movie, which is her death. I don't know if you want to talk about that one.
I do, and this goes back to the Bill Harrison Hollywood thing I saw when I was 10. They did just like this kind of a little cutaway to the moment where Freddy says, "What a rush." But if you can imagine clipping out the few seconds of that scene, you hear Terrence screaming when he says, "What a rush." Out of context of the movie, it's such a weird scream that I thought it was like the sound of whistling pipes or something, because it's just a close up of his face and you're like, "What a rush." And you hear this sound. When I finally saw Elm Street 3, I'm like, wait, that was a scream? It doesn't make any sense to me. But yeah, he attacks her. They get into a knife fight with switchblades and stuff, and you think she's got the upper hand, but then he says, "Why should we fight? We're old friends." And then finger knives become these heroin needles, and she's got these gaping, wounds, these open needle marks on her both arms that just like beg out to be jammed, and he does. It's horrific.
It's a great moment. I mean, and really, even though the effect is so good, the thing that sells that moment is Jennifer Rubin's expression when it's happening. She's kind of up against that wall, and you can kind of tell what that means to her in a way. That's a great moment of acting. Sometimes we don't necessarily look at those as being the memorable moments. We're thinking about the effects or the worm or otherwise, which we'll get to. But that's a moment of an actor actually doing something really interesting in a moment like that is dominated by effects. And so I thought she was effective in the role and in most of the movie. So,
and it's something we see sometimes with drug addict characters in other films. When they overdose or succumb to the drug, it's not just that they're dying. You almost see this sense of defeat. And yeah, so when she's screaming and you see the expression on her face, it's almost like she's crying, because it's like she succumbed to it. And the other thing is, this really comes across great on Blu-ray. It's not an animation. I imagine it's some kind of like a tube or some kind of a practical effect. You see a bulging vein go up her temple. It's like this bulging blue vein of the drugs working their way up into her mind, and it's ghastly.
yes, I mean, this film really has got some of the best effects of any of the movies. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, they have to continue topping themselves in a way, and that's one of the great effects. I mean, there are some others too, which we will get to. You alluded to something earlier. I would love to go circle back to it if we could, and that was Patricia Arquette as our lead character in the film, who almost was fired from the film, I understand, fairly early on. She couldn't remember any of her dialogue. They were shooting a scene at the beginning of the shoot where she's, the big scene in the film where she has to be restrained and she's lashing out and so forth. And apparently she just couldn't remember it. I think they did this scene about 150 times, and they ended up having to give her cue cards to read her dialogue. And so I wondered what you were referring to when you said you wanted to talk about her performance in the film.
I do, because Patricia Arquette is one of those actresses that you can almost see evolve as an actress in real time, looking at her career over the decades, because I'm also a huge fan of True Romance. But I will acknowledge that there are moments in True Romance where you see her delivery where you're like, is this the character? Is this the actress not doing very well? I feel there's a bit of that, in Dream Warriors, because I think this was also her first film, along with Chuck Russell's first movie. So yeah, I think she's a great character, and I think when she gets emotional, like that last scene where she's holding Nancy and kind of, wishing her into a pleasant, dreamland. This is the first time I've seen Elm Street 3 and like cried at the end. It's probably just my soft, middle-aged man emotions or something, but it really got to me this time.
You've been watching Coda too much. I think that's what's going on here. But I just want to say Patricia Arquette is a loopy actress. I would call her her own brand, distinct. I'm saying this the nice way. I like Patricia Arquette, and I liked her in the True Romance. Also, particularly that big scene that she's very well known for in the movie, the very difficult one later in the film, and I think that there are a lot of actors that could benefit from vocal training. And Patricia Arquette might be one. And this is an Oscar-winning actress, of course, as we know, she won the Academy Award for Boyhood. And as the Arquette family goes, I mean, a family of actors, they probably argue that she's the least accomplished, maybe from a technique perspective of Rosanna and David and so on and so forth. But she has a very interesting brand of, what would you call it, delicateness about her in a way that I kind of like, and it's just a way of being. It's not so much acting, but it's a way of being. But that being said, like I do think that she's vocally awkward. I think she has a hard time like delivering dialogue in a way that sounds real or authentic in some way. And she's got a unique voice. There's nobody who sounds like her in the movies. It's a strange and interesting sound to her voice always. And I like the sound of it. Sometimes I think that it needs a little bit of style or vocal training. There's a movie that, just to digress for 1 minute, that has been forgotten, that she was in late what would have been the mid to late 90s, I believe, and it was called Beyond Rangoon, the John Borman film that was set in Burma. It was a true story, and many thought she was miscast in the film. It was kind of a big screen epic story, but I always thought she was fascinating in that movie and gave a great performance. And so I know she has it in her, but I think sometimes she brings it, and sometimes she doesn't necessarily bring it. And so I'm sure many out there would disagree with me, because I know she's beloved.
And I love Patricia Arquette too, but I will agree there is something just kind of off about her. But in the case of Elm Street 3, and as much as we're kind of raving about how rich the script is, the dialogue can be a bit clunky. Like when she's in the one nightmare sequence. I think it's the one where she gets attacked by the worm. It's the centerpiece of the Dokken video. She's following the girl into the house, the little girl on the tricycle, and she says, little girl, little girl. She doesn't deliver it well, but then I was like, is that even, would anybody say that? Like, would a teenager say that, or would they just be like, hello, come back, where are you, hello? Because little girl just sounds so writerly and not dialogue-y.
You would say like sweetheart or something like that, or it's awkward. So I guess we're not expecting her to deliver a Tony-winning Broadway caliber performance or an Oscar-winning performance with what she's given in to sort of in dialogue in this film. I mean, and I think she tries hard, but I think that's strange. I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned it, but it is kind of an unnatural thing to say. So I want to say quickly that you just reminded me, and I don't know if you saw this, but that whole sequence at the beginning of the film where she goes into the house and the young girl is on the tricycle, and of course Freddy turns up and they're running through the house and the fire is kind of coming around them. A couple of years ago, I think it was 2019, the cinematographer and the gaffer actually decided to completely recreate that scene on iPhone 11. They wanted to do a demonstration of like how far technology has come with respect to where it was when this film was created and shot on 35 millimeters. So they actually, believe it or not, they found the location for that. The location still existed for where they had shot that sequence, and they went back there and they found a new actress to kind of play the Kristen character, and they shot it shot for shot on an iPhone, and they put the footage together, which is out there on the internet. And actually, just looking at the footage is pretty extraordinary that you could take a movie that like this and then recreate it on the technology that's in your hand on a phone. And they did do that. So it's kind of fun. It's just as a trivia aside for anybody who wants to go looking for that.
Well, I'm gonna make a note of that, and if I can find it, I'll put a link down below so people can say, I want to see that. That's great. You know, that whole opening scene, even before she gets into the nightmare, really does set the stage for this movie being different. It opens with her mixing up paper mache. Like, what is? I thought this was a Freddy movie. And then when they get into the nightmare, there's that scene where she wanders into the room and it's all the dead kids, you know, hanging from nooses, which if you want to get into the subtext is like all these people she knows and friends are dying of suicide. And you know, there's just so much going on in every detail of this film that I wish that the other Freddy movies had taken the proper lesson, which is you don't have to go big on the nightmare stuff, you have to go deep. You know, if they had gotten darker and weirder and just relied on the idea that you can put some great nightmare sequences together that aren't so pop referential heavy and, you know, laugh out loud, and still have stuff that people are going to talk about years and years later. The only reason I talk about later Nightmare on Elm Street dream sequences is to talk about how, you know, much I don't really care for them.
Well, but because the thing is, out of all the franchises out there, if we looked at the long-running franchises from Child's Play to Friday the 13th to Halloween to, go down the list of the movies that have multiple sequels and legions of fans following them, the Nightmare on Elm Street series is unique in that the very notion of the analysis of dreams is a real thing in psychology. And and there's so much about the human condition and individual human psyche in the dreams. And so there's an opportunity in these films to be able to exploit that at every opportunity. And what better way to build characters by showing us their anxieties and fears and manifestations of all of that in the dreams. And I think these films kind of do that on and off. This film does it probably more than any of the others. I mean, sometimes in the others you get a little mired down in the things that we all dream about, which is getting our feet stuck in mud, and that's at the beginning of this one too. But not being able to run away or otherwise. But this one is trying to do something. It's trying to get at something a little more kind of meaningful about the psychology of the people and using the notion of, how do we interpret our dreams? What do they tell us about us in a way that's interesting?
I think a lot of that comes back to, Wes Craven's idea for this, for the first Nightmare on Elm Street, which was based on, an actual news story that he read. The When a filmmaker or a storyteller has an idea for something, a piece of pop entertainment that's grounded and has sort of a whole philosophy behind it, you can tell. And even though Craven didn't write this, I feel like, Russell, Wagner, and Darabont, they came together to tell a story that expands on Craven's stories, but I don't think Craven could have told this story in this particular way because he's much more, kind of serious and cerebral. You look at Kevin Williamson, what he did with Scream, everyone kind of credits, oh my God, Wes Craven reinvented horror. It was pretty much Kevin Williamson. Not to take anything away from Craven, but yeah, I think the influences and the expansion of those ideas is really strong in this film. And I also love that something I didn't catch before, they do the thing in this movie that I usually hate in other movies where they get really clever with a sign. The institution that these kids are at is called Weston Hills.
Yeah.
You just say it, it's Weston Hills, who cares? When we first see the establishing shot of the Weston Hills, you see the name, but it's behind a wrought iron gate. And the only three letters that are not obscured are Wes.
Yeah.
The
Right.
Tin Hills is like behind the iron bar, but it's not like a neon sign like, hey, everybody, remember who made this, franchise? It's a very subtle thing that I did not pick up on it until my 20th viewing of this movie in over 35 years.
Yeah, and everything in a film is contrived. Nothing's an accident, so that's not a coincidence, right? And I think there's another one in the series that has the word "crave" or something like that in a sign or something prominent. Yeah,
I'm pretty sure it's part 4. The diner that Alice works at is the Crave Inn.
yes, that's it. Yeah, yeah.
Not so much. I loved that when I was 11, but now I'm like, oh, it's just so cringe.
It's oh boy, Wes Craven might even think it was cringe. I remember once I did an interview with Wes Craven, and we were talking about all the movies that he'd made, and I was lamenting the fact that Deadly Blessing hadn't been released. You loved Deadly Blessing when I was a teenager. The whole Maren Jensen and the hit hype community and the whole bit. And he said, I don't know who's got the rights to it now. I would love to get it released. Of course, it's been released now many years later. But at the same time, there's another journalist in the room who said, when we were talking about Deadly Blessing, they interjected and said, hey, what about Deadly Friend? And then Wes Craven looked at both of us and he went, oh, please, like, And so I think, Wes Craven was, it didn't suffer fools on this kind of stuff and probably would have felt it was cringe, as you said also.
Yeah, I still have to see Deadly Friend. I have the recent Blu-ray.
You don't, believe me, you don't. Yeah.
I'm curious. I want to know what the deal is with that exploding basketball head scene. But any other kind of like thoughts or anything that we've missed? I mean, I feel like we could break this movie down for like as long as the runtime, but unfortunately neither of us have that kind of time.
Well, I think that we haven't talked about the snake at all, which is so important in the lore of the franchise. Which that sequence is the construction of that sequence. And if those who are listening or watching do a little digging, you can certainly find out those stories of how that was shot. And the stories are just so interesting. The reverse printing of the film because they could get it to function the way they needed to. And then the pig, of course, on the table at the beginning, which is super cool. And as you know, Ian, probably to create a pig was going to be too expensive, and the studio rejected it. So they used a real pig and put somebody under the table and probably put their hand in the mouth of the pig or something like that in that moments. But when we look at the pig and we look at the snake and things like this, what we're really talking about is just the joy of practical effects. I mean, there was computer generated effects at the time. They could have taken a different route, but these are really great effects. I mean, I also really love the not dancing, but the animated skeleton that comes, of course, it figures in the climax, the holy water and the whole bit. And so I thought there was something about it that was, practical, real, and low tech in a way that was so much fun to watching it now and really convincing. I love the face of Freddy on the snake's face, which I thought was really cool. I love the decapitation of Kristen's mother and the holding of the Freddy speaking through her mouth. I love the Hall of Mirrors in the film. I think that's kind of visually well done also. So I think all of that is really good. It's got one of the classic lines of this series, welcome to prime time, that line, of course, too. And it's also kind of having fun. It's got a little spirit of fun with the Dick Cavett and Zsa Zsa Gabor part of it too, which is kind of fun too. I mean, people watch the movie now, young people not know who either one of those people are, but at the time it was kind of a big deal. So I think there's just a lot of interesting things. And when you put the cast together, people who went on to, we have Patricia Arquette and Lawrence Fishburne and Craig Wasson, who was, no slouch. I mean, this is a Broadway actor and also somebody who'd been in Body Double and Ghost Story and so many other films and not just thrillers, And so I think that there's a lot of talent in this film, Darabont and Chuck Russell. And so I think with that much talent comes a lot of ingenuity. And it's interesting also because even though the fans embraced this movie and people really like it, and for the most part, it was not that well received critically. I mean, even Roger himself, gave it 1.5 stars and so forth. I always think this is heartbreaking that people put so many years of life, money, work, vision, creativity, storyboarding, building with facts, all this sort of stuff that goes into making a film, which it's a miracle any film can ever get made. And the film just ends up kind of getting dismissed very, very easily when it's released. But this film, luckily, grew over the years, like a lot of these films do. It really grew over the years, and it's been reappraised in a way, I think, as well. And it certainly made a lot of money. I mean, 4 times the budget of $4 million at a $40 million or $44 million, I think, box office gross. So it made a lot of money. So, I think it's a pretty solid entry in this whole franchise. I still would put it for me beneath the first one, the second one, A New Nightmare. Even though a lot of people like to joke on the second one, I can't separate my nostalgia from when I saw it, And so that's my go-to when I'm going to watch one of these. I always go to the second one. But this is a respectable movie that has a few things on its mind, and I enjoyed it. I didn't think there was anything particularly bad about it that we had to forgive. I thought it was a pretty solid movie.
And there is something, I shouldn't drop this in right as we're going to go, but I just remembered it. And I made a note about this. We didn't talk about Freddy's mom and his new origin story, which is a very hard thing to pull off because we found out Freddy's origin in the first movie. But in this one, we find out, there's an origin before the origin. and it's really horrific. You know, mom was a nun in an insane asylum in the 40s and got locked in over holiday break and raped hundreds of times. And then Freddie, you know, came out of that. But Sister Mary Helena, the nun, shows up as an apparition to kind of give Dr. Gordon some advice on how to deal with this problem. And it's just, it's something that I think she shows up in the next movie, you know, as sort of just as a presence or a kind of a callback. But what I loved about this film is they presented this sort of cosmic duality. You've got the evil of Freddy Krueger, but then you've got this sense of lightness in the universe that is trying to, it can't just stomp it out itself. It sort of has to work through people. But it's this really interesting idea of the chess game between good and evil that if you're going to explore big ideas in the sequels, I would like to see more of that.
I mean, it was very well written. The moment where she explains to Craig Wasson the history of Freddie's mother. Of course, when we realized later at the end of the movie that was her, right? I think so. So I thought that was good. I thought the dialogue in that scene was good, and it was an appropriate kind of backstory. I believed it, and it was evil enough to be appropriate for the character of Freddie. So I thought that was well done. I liked how she kind of drifted in and out of the film. I always like those metaphors of nuns who show up when there's an impending apocalypse and they appear and disappear, or otherwise. And there's a lot of them in the horror genre, but I thought it was very well used in this film.
Yeah, and then there's that whole like graveyard scene, the junkyard graveyard, where you know Dr. Gordon is burying Freddy's bones, and you know he's been slashed to ribbons, but he still throws the holy water on it and the cross. And then in the dream world, you see that the light opening up on Freddy. It's just such a cool idea and visual that, you know, again, I don't think these ideas were topped in very many of the sequels, with the exception of possibly New Nightmare, but that's because it's its own thing.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I love when the other sequence I think is super cool is when they all go in, when they're in the it's called the quiet room, I think, and then suddenly they're in the dream world, and in the whole kind of set is closing in on them, kind of like the Star Wars trash compactor in a way, and the walls are smoking, and all this stuff is happening around them. I think that stuff is not easy to pull off from a technical perspective, and so we have to get points for that stuff, because the building of the sets, the lighting of those sets, the you know, all of that, just the full physical realization of that demonic world in a way. I think the movie does really well on this front. Like the dream worlds are they're pretty scary. So I admired that. I liked that set, and I thought it was fun to see that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, you know, movie on a lot of fronts, I think. But yeah, well, that's Dream Warriors at 35. I think it holds up very well. I don't know what teenagers today would think of it, you know, just watching it, you know, right out of the box, so to speak. But I know for me, it's one of those rare moments of nostalgia where I can go back and look at it and be like, I'm not embarrassed to love this movie.
I know. I mean, more and more as time goes on, I'm less embarrassed, because most of the movies today that in the horror genre are just not any good. You know, so once in a while we get a movie like X that's pretty good, the new Ty West film. But these movies get better as time goes on, because you know they get more and more cynical now. They're more and more computer generated. There's just, if I see one more kind of Insidious or Conjuring movie with you know, the barking nuns and so forth, and all those, you know, apparitions that don't scare me at all, and go back to a movie like this, and it has a diabolical villain in it who's threatening to cut you up to ribbons, you know, and there's something super scary about that. And I guess I always say that I think I prefer low concept horror films. You know, if you just give me, you know, 6 or 7 or 8 people in a woods and are being chased around, and they happen to be camp counselors, it's even better. But I prefer things just to be super, you know, back to the origins, the brass tacks of a slasher film. So, but this movie, you know, is not that. Although I always like visions that are fully realized like this, and this one was, in a way. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate this series too. And I think that you know, it might be true that New Nightmare is probably the smartest one in the whole series, and the most interesting one, just all the paradoxes between what's real and what isn't real in a way. But this one might be just the most ingenious in terms of how it's built and the sequences that it puts together. So I think it has that going for it, and I thought Chuck Russell did a really good job. So
I did too. I took an elevator ride with him once at a comic convention in Florida about 20 years ago, and I was so starstruck that I forgot that he'd done Dream Warrior. So I was asking questions about The Mask. And what's even better was he was on his way to go to dinner with Frank Darabont. It's like, can I
Oh, that's funny.
please come? But no, he was
That's
super nice.
gone, yes.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, The Mask will always be just a fun. I like Eraser. He directed Eraser with Schwarzenegger, which I was thought was just sharply directed. But
And the Blob,
Mask,
the Blob remake.
Blob,
Yeah.
that too, right? So, but he's got a very I don't know how we would describe his visual sense with respect to effects, but there are just things in his movies I really love. Like, do you remember the scene in The Mask where Jim Carrey's alter ego actually sees Cameron Diaz for the first time, and the heart is kind of thumping out of his chest in a way. There's so much of that ingenuity in Chuck Russell's movies. So I admire that. And here's a toast to filmmakers that work very well in genre films. Not everybody's going to be Spielberg. That there are people that are going to deliver genre films that will go on forever, that you're going to be, as Dick Cavett said in some of the extras for this film, if you looked at them on the Blu-ray, that he said, if you're involved in these types of films, there's going to be an incredible new audience that will open up to you. They're very loyal, and it'll be a forever audience in a way. So when you look at a filmmaker like Chuck Russell, you have a legacy. I mean, these, we're loyal. I mean, we're not going to forget these films. We'll continue to watch them. And I'd argue that the films of Chuck Russell are going to be watched much more than the films of some of the A-list directors today.
I want to watch Chuck Russell films more than I want to watch some of the A-list directors. They draw you in, and they're very entertaining for various reasons.
Very much.
So, yeah. All right, Lee Shoquist of ChicagoFilm.com, which has been newly redesigned and revamped, folks. Go check it out. It's really cool looking. Very well done, sir.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for talking Elm Street. It's been too long. We got to do more of these.
We're going to do more. There's no shortage of movies, right? So
yeah. All right, man. Take care.
All right. Next time.
All right. Bye.